Martin, let's start this week by having a look at this news from Saudi Arabia, with the possibility that the Saudi king will be stepping down and crowning his 32-year-old son as the new king. Are you surprised to hear that?
Well, no. I mean, MBS, as he is known, the new king, has been pretty much in charge for some time because his father is senile, not to put too fine a point on it.
His name's Mohammed bin Salman. You like calling him MBS?
MBS is apparently his nickname.
Why might the Israelis actually be interested in making him king? And what power do they have to do that?
Well, it may or may not be news to our listeners. It shouldn't be that the Israeli right wing and the Saudi right wing have actually got a shared enemy in Iran, and they are basically on the same page, along with us, of course. We're on their side too.
So the Persians are not really Arabs, but they're certainly all Muslims. How come Israel and the Muslim country of Saudi might be ganging up against other Muslims?
Well, because both Israel and Saudi Arabia are essentially Western-oriented puppet states. They are there to... they've got their own vested interest and their own ruling classes in both states, but those ruling classes are aligned with the United States and with Britain. And therefore, we're all on the same side, supposedly, to keep the masses in the Middle East in under the thumb, as they have been for several hundred years, and Britain has played a major role in that for all that time.
No, it's the Daily Mail that's reporting this. They say the King of Saudi Arabia plans to step down and announce his son as his successor next week. The move is seen as a final step in 32-year-old Prince Mohammed bin Salman's power grab, which began earlier this month with the arrests of more than 40 princes and government ministers. And a corruption probe. The source said King Salman will continue only as a ceremonial figurehead, handing over official leadership to the country to his son, often referred to, as you quite rightly said, as MBS. Unless something drastic happens, King Salman will announce the appointment of MBS as King of Saudi Arabia next week.
Well, that's right. And he's also basically pushing for a war with Iran. People out there need to listen and understand the Israeli leadership and the Saudi leadership and the American leadership want a war with Iran. They're speaking about it in words of fire 10 feet high. I ask you, people listening to this show, do you want to go to war with Iran? Because that's where our Conservative government is going to take us, because that's what all these other people want, and apparently we want it too. Do we want a war with Iran?
That is our democratically elected Conservative government, Martin.
That would be the one which hasn't actually got a mandate of 50% plus one of the vote. And of course that wouldn't be counted as a legitimate regime in some parts of the world.
The DUP have elected to join them, haven't they?
Yes, but even if you add the DUP votes to the Tory vote, it's still not 50% plus one, unlike every other European country which has a different electoral setup. And of course it's not the case in the United States. Trump didn't get 50% plus one of the vote in the United States, but we're supposed to just accept that. Of course, if it was in Russia and Putin had less than 50% of the vote, we'd be saying that he was illegitimate. We're saying he's illegitimate anyway, or the mainstream are, even though he's got something like 80% of the vote. But when the two rice bowls clash, we'll see which one is fuller, because actually the Western system lacks legitimacy, and if you're going to have a world war, you've got to have the legitimacy. And of course the government in Iran, the government in Russia, and probably the government in China have got more popular support than the Western leadership.
OK, antiwar.com is reporting Saudi Arabia is attacking Yemen, blockading the nation to a famine. They've also caused a regional row, a split with Qatar, and a threatening Lebanon. In its comments today, Saudi Foreign Minister Abdel Jubeir attributed every single action the Saudis have taken to Iranian aggression. Jubeir insisted this was obvious to everyone and that all Saudi actions have been their way of saying enough is enough to Iran. They believe, of course, that Iran is actually been interfering in Yemen, and that's why they had to go in there.
Well, they would say that, wouldn't they? Basically, the Saudis and the West and the Israelis have been provoking war from the get-go. And if ultimately they may get the war they claim to want, but whether they can win it is another question, whether it's in Lebanon or in Iran.
OK, well, Haaretz today are also saying Israeli military chief is giving unprecedented interview to Saudi media, ready to share intelligence with Iran. So there is an intelligence sharing agreement. Is that something that's been going on?
With Saudi Arabia, not with Iran.
About Iran,
yeah.
Sorry, yes. On Iran, yeah. So this is Israel and Saudi Arabia are in full agreement about Iran's intentions. Lieutenant General Gadi Eisenkot tells Elaf noting that the two states have never fought each other. And the Saudi newspapers published an unprecedented interview on Thursday with Israeli military chief, Lieutenant General Gadi Eisenkot. It marks the first time that any senior Israeli Defence Forces officer, let alone the Chief of Staff, has been interviewed by a media organisation in Saudi Arabia, which doesn't actually have official diplomatic ties with Israel. In an interview, Eisenkot called Iran the real and largest threat to the entire region.
Well, they've basically been cooperating for years, and all we're seeing now is that cooperation coming into the open. Ultimately, for example, if the Israelis were to carry out a strike on Iran, they could fly to Saudi Arabia and carry out the strike from Saudi soil, and that's definitely been discussed. But both Israel and Saudi Arabia are not strong enough to fight Iran on their own. What they're going to do is provoke a war with Iran and then turn round to the Americans and us, the British, and say, oh, we're at war with Iran now, can you help us out, please, because it's already started. And at that point, of course, the British should definitely say, no, you're on your own with this one.
OK, a couple of stories to do with ISIS, because we're seeing apparently the end game of the attacks on ISIS. One is a domestic one, Martin. It's in the Daily Express, saying that Britain's returning from ISIS territory do not justify prosecution. Says the terror watchdog, Britain's returning from ISIS territory don't justify prosecution, and that is in the Express. That, I mean, it does sound a bit strange, doesn't it? If you're off fighting for ISIS, surely when you come back you should at least face questioning. But the government's new independent reviewer of terrorist legislation, Max Hill QC, says the authorities have decided not to charge returnees. He said, we are told we do have a significant number already back in this country who have previously gone to Iraq and Syria. Now, the obvious question here, Martin, is what if these people start letting off bombs in Britain?
Well, the obvious question is, well, how did they get to Syria and Iraq in the first place? They were probably recruited by MI6, because ISIS, of course, is basically a Western front. Very interestingly, this week, the BBC have reported, can I just point this out, that at Raqqa, the Western-backed forces and the YPG, who we're probably going to cover in a moment, allowed thousands of ISIS fighters with weaponry to leave the city and disperse. Because in actual fact, the Western powers support
Martin,
ISIS.
That's part of a peace agreement, surely.
No. Listen,
they're saying, look, if you let us take the city and we'll let you go.
Yeah, but at the same time, they've been bombing the city indiscriminately and killing many civilians. So it's not about saving civilian life.
Okay, so they would say militarily, we bombed them to the position where they've now agreed to leave the city.
Well, you could say that, but the deal leads to a situation where thousands of, and also, of course, what's been pointed out by the Iranians and the Russians is that at Des Azores, US helicopters came in and took out foreign leaders of ISIS to be redeployed elsewhere. The Iranian General Staff, the Russian General Staff and the Syrian General Staff have been saying this all along, that ISIS is in fact a front organisation for Saudi Arabia and the West. And of course they are right.
So all this stuff with Peshmerga and also with Saudi Arabia in Israel starts to look as if this is the next stage of the game. Now ISIS is on its last legs.
That's right. Well, ISIS is basically a cat's paw that's deployed, it's like a fox, and we breed foxes so that we can go tally-ho, there's a fox, and then we can intervene.
And now we're in a situation with US bases in Syria that the Russians have got to deal with. Yeah,
that's right. And of course, what the Kurds, the Kurdish forces, which are pressing on to try and take the oil fields in Syria, there's no Kurdish population in that area. But they're being pushed to take the oil fields to prevent the Syrian government from recapturing them. And of course, when ISIS carries out attacks in the West, because of their close links to the Saudis and Western intelligence services, we have to presume that those attacks are actually being carried out by our own intelligence services. That's what a serious police force, like the one in Italy, or possibly the one in Northern Ireland, would be starting to ask.
So what Reuters are saying is that recent developments in Syria's Raqqa show that the Kurdish YPG militia, backed by the United States, is more concerned about capturing territory than actually fighting Islamic State, the Turkish Foreign Minister Mevlut Cavusoglu said in a speech yesterday. Turkey's expressed anger. A convoy of Islamic State fighters were allowed to withdraw from Raqqa last month as part of an agreement with the YPG, saying it was appalled by the US's stance on the issue. But I mean, you could see this as a merciful act, couldn't you?
Well, you could, but it's interesting that the BBC have reported it and it's been totally ignored in the media in the United States. If we're going to have a policy of allowing ISIS fighters to escape from certain places and take their weaponry with them, then we need to discuss whether that is our policy or not. rather than just presume that's what we've agreed. Now, what the Russians are contending is that the YPG and ISIS are actually cooperating, and that's also what the Turks are saying, as you've just said, which is pretty rich, really, because the Turks were major supporters of ISIS when they were aligned with Western policy.
Yeah, until the
YPG appeared, and then they
until the coup attempt. Surely there's been a whole switch.
Right. That's right.
Actually, ISIS, the beginning of the end of ISIS was the Russian intervention, yes, but also the coup attempt.
Yes, and the Russians intervened in that to warn Erdogan and basically saved his life. Now,
can we just get back to the domestic stuff? Because I think this is what will be concerning most people out there. What are MI5 doing, saying it's okay for ISIS people to come back? We know exactly who they are, and they're not going to be prosecuted. Well, it's not a decision, apparently, that MI5 and others will have taken lightly, this new terror watchdog chappie, Max Hill says. They, I am sure, will have looked intensely at each individual on return.
They looked intensely at them before they went out there, because at the Old Bailey a couple of years ago, a guy was put on trial for preparing to go to Syria to fight for a jihadist group, and he defended himself by saying, yes, but the group itself was orchestrated by MI6, and it was MI6 who recruited me. Now, this is the reason why they're allowed to come back, is because in actual fact they're on the payroll, and that most of the terrorism that's been carried out in the Western countries since 9/11 has been orchestrated by the intelligence services using Islamists as the front.
Okay,
and that's been the fact. That's just the basic pattern of what we're talking about.
Let's start talking about specific numbers. An estimated 850 Britons have reportedly travelled to Syria in the last 6 years, with 120 apparently killed in fighting. That leaves, 630. Half of those remaining are said to have already returned to the UK, but they won't be prosecuted.
No, because don't forget, the intelligence services would say, "Oh, we're just keeping an eye on them to see what they lead us to." Blah 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 blah. But in actual fact,
what have they been trained to do out in?
They've probably been trained to do pretty similar to the Manchester bomber was trained to do, which is to actually build a viable bomb. And they've been he was trained to build a viable bomb, probably when he was in Libya, probably trained by somebody from Hereford who knows how to build viable bombs. That's the reality. As we go into World War III, and that's where we're going, Tony, people have got to face the facts that our intelligence services and special forces are the source of Islamist terrorism. The two things are absolutely linked, not just in Syria, where it's absolutely obvious, but also back here when attacks take place. And the police force have got to take a step back and start really investigating these incidents.
Oh, sorry, but they've just been cut. There are hardly any police left.
Indeed, and of course, as we all know, they are way down the food chain compared to the intelligence services. But if the police force don't get their finger out, and of course in Italy, the police force did get its finger out. It took them decades, but they pointed the finger very firmly at NATO intelligence services as the source of terrorism.
OK, as this trouble spreads now, ISIS has been defeated to places like Saudi Arabia, to Yemen, also Lebanon. Lebanese Prime Minister has accepted an invite to France. Claims that Lebanese Prime Minister Saad Hariri is definitely not being held against his will in Saudi Arabia. Well, poppycock, I say. And he was going to return to Lebanon within 2 days. Absolute nonsense. Well, it definitely won't be coming to pass. Instead, Hariri is going to France.
That's because Macron went for a chat with MBS. And of course everybody's lining up now for this war with Iran in the Middle East, which I stress to our listeners, that's where we're going. Do you want a war with Iran? Because if you don't, you better start thinking about what you're going to do to stop it. OK, what about the claims about Russia Today in Washington, which bizarrely I appeared on like a week before they started making a big fuss about it on the Sean Stone programme, Watching the Hawks, for 20 minutes or so. And that actually does look as if now the Russians are starting to bite back, actually. They're naming 9 US-funded media outlets which will face an enabler of foreign agents over in Russia. They've sent written notices to Voice of America and Radio Free Europe informing them that they will be affected by the Russian Parliament's new media law, allowing for the labelling of certain foreign media as foreign agents. Well, it's this sort of tit-for-tattery is the run-up to a world war. So that's what's happening.
We've had interviews on Newsnight and on the Daily Politics with people from RT. They're saying effectively that RT is in complete denial about the hacking of the US election, effectively spinning the US election and affecting elections. I mean, you're not going to try and deny, are you, that Russia does this kind of thing?
I am, because the evidence is, if there was any solid evidence, we would have seen it, and we haven't seen anything.
This week, Theresa May has also added her voice to saying that Russians are interfering in British general elections too. Although
she's rode back on that this very day, because in actual fact, as she saw in her Mansion House speech, she didn't give a single example of what she was talking about, and she said, well, I don't mean that they've interfered in Britain in the Brexit vote, I just mean that in general they've interfered. And what they mean by interfered is Russia Today has acted like a news organisation reporting on elections, and that is interference as far as they're concerned.
Now, haven't the US a bit of a record of interfering in elections
themselves? They do indeed.
The
National Endowment for Democracy in the United States will no doubt spend millions of taxpayer dollars in Russia in the run-up to the presidential election in March. They will fund the people they want, probably Alexei Navalny, to a very large extent. He won't win, but they will spend an awful lot of money to try and get him elected. And don't forget that Al Jazeera discovered that the Israeli government had spent £1 million inside the British Labour Party to try and control the policy.
Well, I don't
now,
think
that's the sort of thing that goes on out there.
They didn't say they'd spent £1 million. They said they had £1 million slush fund for anyone that was willing to actually bring Israeli lobbying into the Labour Party through new lobby groups within the party.
Indeed. Now, the fact is that the Russians have got a fraction of the resources that the West has got. They obviously try and get their message out there. They obviously try and communicate, their desires and wishes.
They've got a massive military, and also Russia Today is an enormous network.
It's an enormous network.
Millions of viewers.
Yes, but it's got millions of viewers, but in terms of resources, it's absolutely minuscule compared to things like Sky News, for example, or Fox.
Which, by the way, are having financial trouble. The Murdoch empire is, apparently.
Well, that's because all conventional media are being undermined by the revolution in internet technology and so on.
I mean, classifying these as foreign agents, Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, there are 9 outlets apparently in Russia that are going to be are going to be affected by this, and they are all just different language versions, apparently, of Radio Free Europe, which targets various parts of the Russian Federation. Now, I mean, both sides are doing this. What's the problem?
Well, if both sides are doing it, both sides are doing it. Let's just let's have no Queensberry rules, gloves off, and just punching. And on that basis, the Kiev snipers, the snipers that actually carried out the shootings in the Maidan Square at the beginning of the Ukraine crisis, they were in Il Giornale, which is an Italian newspaper this week, saying we were brought in from Georgia to shoot both police and protesters, and we were working for the current government, not the Yanukovych government, the current government. So in actual fact, the Western intelligence services killed those protesters on the Maidan Square. The Kiev snipers who did it have actually confessed this week in Il Giornale, which is an Italian newspaper. Is that going to be broadcast on the BBC, that we killed those people? Because, of course, the contention is that it was the pro-Russian government that had killed those people, but in actual fact, it wasn't them, it was us. It was us. And, of course, the weaponry probably came from Britain, and the training was at Warsaw Police Academy.
There was some evidence, actually, on a BBC documentary about it, that it was British weapons.
Yes, indeed.
Anyway, let's just quote from Il Journal. This article we'll put a link up to on our show page at thisweek.org.uk. Well, it's in Italian, so hopefully you'll have some translation system, not necessarily Google, the evil Google, to translate it for you. Everyone started shooting 2 or 3 shots at a time. It went on for 15 or 20 minutes. We had no choice. We were ordered to shoot both on the police and on the demonstrators without any difference. I was totally outraged. But, I mean, how can a soldier say he's got no choice when he's ordered to shoot?
These were mercenaries brought in from Georgia related to Saakashvili. Now, we don't know what the full we've always suspected that this was what took place, because Umas Piets, the Estonian foreign minister, gave a telephone call to Catherine Ashton, who was the EU's representative, and said, well, the information we're getting is that the snipers who killed these people were working for the new regime, not the old regime, the new regime. And of course the new regime was working very closely with, guess who? CIA, MI6. Those people that are supporting ISIS, the same stuff. And it's exactly the same plot and plan in every situation. It's create chaos and then use that chaos to try and advance your political goals. And it is terrorism by any definition, and it's our secret services who are the main perpetrators.
Also looking over at the Asia-Pacific region, meeting with Japanese Defence Minister, the US Pacific Commander Admiral Harry Harris, emphasised yesterday the role of America's massive military presence in the Pacific plays in any potential diplomatic efforts towards North Korea. Clearly, he said, while diplomacy must be the main effort with North Korea, it has to be diplomacy backed by credible military power. Harris insisted at the start of the meeting that diplomacy is the main focus at all, is something the US officials have been loath to admit. US idea of a credible military power, it seems, hinges heavily on threats to start a massive war unilaterally. So what is the strategy here? Is this just sabre rattling, or is there any real strategy?
I don't think they have got a real strategy, because once North Korea has got nuclear weapons, and it's perfectly logical why they've got nuclear weapons, it's the same logic why Britain's got nuclear weapons. It's just an insurance policy. And once they've got nuclear weapons, war is actually impossible unless you're going to have a nuclear war.
More about North Korea today. Apparently North Korea's got a secret weapon. Kim Jong-un sets alarm bells ringing in the United States with shock pictures of some kind of special way of terrifying weapon of some sort to sink ships. I'm not quite sure exactly how it works, but I mean, is this real? Is it propaganda? I mean, it does seem as if the North Koreans are generating stuff. I mean, we've seen before, haven't we, that in their military parades there have actually been ballistic missiles that are made of wood. So they're just trying to pretend, I guess.
Well, we don't know is the simple answer, but you've got to recognise that the era of the aircraft carrier is definitely over. Well, the US has a preponderance of aircraft carriers, but they are effectively just great big sitting targets in the modern era.
They're developing apparently powerful new submarines capable of firing deadly ballistic missiles from the sub.
Well, that's the same technology as we've got with Trident, and they're developing it for the same reasons we're developing it, just in case somebody attacks them. They won't dare, because we've got this, they're not relying on the Chinese nuclear umbrella, nor do we rely upon the US nuclear umbrella. That's why Britain has an independent deterrent, so-called.
How can we stop North Korea's aggressive building schedule?
We can't. North Korea has developed nuclear weapons, just like Pakistan, just like Israel, just like South Africa did, although they got rid of them. And once a country becomes a nuclear country, then that's it. You cannot attack them without starting a nuclear war. That's exactly why they've developed nuclear weapons. The logic of it is impeccable, because they haven't been, they agreed not to develop nuclear weapons in the 90s and started to build peaceful nuclear program and cooperate with the South, and that's how eventually you might have developed a dynamic to some kind of solution of that conflict.
Let's just have a look at two stories. I mean, we dealt already with this first one, which is Britain's, and the headline in the Daily Express was, Britain's returning from ISIS territory do not justify prosecution, says the terror watchdog. But on the other hand, there's an EU terror warning. The United States has issued winter travel alert amidst heightened threats in Europe. So how do we square these two?
It's quite straightforward, Tony. Basically, most of this so-called terrorist threat, particularly the Islamist terrorist threat, is orchestrated by Western intelligence services. They set up Al-Qaeda in the 1980s. They created ISIS, as General Flynn pointed out when he was interviewed. ISIS was created by the West. Al-Baghdadi met with John McCain when John McCain went to inside Syria. And so the main population are bombarded with propaganda about ISIS are out to get you, Al-Qaeda are the enemy, these these terrible people are trying to blow you up. Oh, they have blown you up. But in actual fact, these organisations are orchestrated by the Western intelligence services working very closely with the Saudis, bringing the circle back round again.
Well,
MBS.
We mentioned the media and this sort of media war between Washington and Russia. Also this week, a BBC journalist, this is reported by Middle East Monitor, has deleted her tweet about Britain's corrupt relationship with Israel. This is Laura Koonsberg, prominent BBC journalist, deleted a tweet in which a senior Tory MP can be seen complaining about the British media turning a blind eye to the corrupt relationship that has allowed Israel to buy access to Westminster. The tweet was posted by BBC's political editor Laura Koonsberg on Wednesday, while the Scottish journalist was covering the build-up to the resignation of Priti Patel. This is last week. The Secretary of State for International Development had taken part in undisclosed meetings in Israel organised by the powerful Conservative Friends of Israel lobby. The Twitter post on the day, which some bright sparks saved, she says, strong words. A senior Tory says Lord Pollack should be chucked out of the party, claiming the entire apparatus has turned a blind eye to a corrupt relationship that allows a country to buy access, referring to Israel. Strong words, she tweeted, but then she deleted her tweet.
Well, she's no doubt had her arm twisted up her back, because that demonstrates the point that she made in the tweet itself, doesn't it?
The Middle East Monitor contacted Koonsberg to see why she deleted the tweet, but they didn't get a reply. So it does seem as if there is this Israel lobby still, Martin, very powerful here in Britain. Mm-hmm. And, of course, that would be a decisive factor if it does come to a war with Iran and between Iran and Israel, and especially if Saudi Arabia weighs in as well. A great friend of ours, apparently, because they supply so much of our oil.
Well, I don't know if we get a lot of our oil from Saudi Arabia. They buy an awful lot of our weaponry, but that's another matter. Yes, I'm quite sure that the establishment in this country is definitely in the pocket of the Saudis and the Israelis. But I think the ordinary people in this country, A, haven't been warned that they're going to war with Iran, and B, there's no guarantee that they're going to support it. If the Tory government takes us to war with Iran to support Saudi Arabia and Israel, they deserve to be drummed out of office forthwith, and hopefully that's exactly what would happen.
In the meantime, we've heard this week that a homeless ex-soldier, 82 years old, has died hours after being evicted from his squat. This is reported in the Daily Mirror. Pretty horrific, Martin, that someone should be evicted aged 82, especially an ex-soldier. And I just wonder... it says other homeless ex-servicemen took the man, known only as George, to hospital, but he passed away with them at his bedside. He was basically found just lying in the street.
Well, we were talking about universal credit in the first hour, and all the evidence shows that introduction of universal credit will massively increase homelessness. Massively. Because lots of people will simply fall into rent arrears and be evicted. Just as you said, in the run-up to Christmas, is a fantastic Christmas present for the poorest people in the country from our glorious government, eh?